Donald Trump, meanwhile, also says his administration is working well with Venezuela's interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez, and that he would be open to meeting with her. Trump's upbeat remarks came just over a week after Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro was seized in a U.S. Special Forces raid and brought to New York to face drug trafficking charges. Trump has said that the U.S. now has de facto control of Venezuela as it enforces a naval blockade of the South American nation's vital oil exports. Well, France 24's senior reporter James Andre has just come back from Colombia, where he was reporting on the Venezuelan border. He joins me now on the set. James, first of all, what were things like when you were reporting there?
Well, actually, what happened when we arrived in Cucuta, we were expecting there might be, for example, massive population movements out of Venezuela. Well, there was none of that. Actually, things were pretty calm on the border. There had strengthened security. There were tanks there. There was a lot of international press as well, trying to get into the country, just like ourselves. Now, that did not happen. You know, everybody at the very first stages was wondering if the regime would actually simply collapse after Maduro had been, withdrawn, or if it would carry on. And indeed, well, what we did see was basically Delcy Rodriguez, who was, Maduro's vice president, then be sworn in. Her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, becoming also sworn in as the interim leader of the parliament. And in a sense, well, basically the regime carrying on without Maduro, which of course was of great disappointment to the Venezuelans we spoke to, because a lot of them in Colombia, of course, are opponents to the Maduro regime, saying, well, looks like what we have now is basically the Maduro regime without Maduro, and state-sponsored by the United States, who wants basically to grab Venezuelan oil. So that, of course, is not very satisfactory for them. We even spoke to the head of a furniture company, professional furniture company operating inside Venezuela, because basically people just cross the border very, very simply. And he'd come over for a couple of days into Colombia, and he was telling us, look, I have 20 employees. I mean, I can put up with a year with no income, but I'd like to see things change. And he was very worried that that might indeed happen. So that gives you an idea of what the atmosphere was on the border.
Right. And as you were saying, things in Colombia were relatively calm until Colombia was also threatened by Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe a couple of days into our trip, well, Donald Trump said that Colombia, and I quote, is a sick country led by a sick man. He was, of course, talking about Gustavo Petro, the president, who likes to produce cocaine and send it into the United States. And he made it quite clear that he was looking at the possibility of military intervention in Colombia. Now, initially, we were in Cucuta, so that's the city that's on the border. We were very surprised to speak to Colombians because, of course, in fact, Cucuta is a right-hand stronghold, telling us that they don't like President Petro much and that they saw that as quite a good thing that the United States could intervene in Colombia. So we were quite surprised. Other people, of course, on the left were telling us that they didn't see why the United States would want to intervene in a country where there is a democratically elected president. But, of course, all this comes with a backdrop of a war of words between both presidents, with starting basically in January when President Petro refused the American planes landing in Colombia to deport migrants, saying that the conditions were inhumane. And then from then on, it's just been a progression in verbal violence between both presidents that culminated with eventually Donald Trump actually barring President Petro from entering the United States and sanctioning him personally. So that's where we stood at the beginning of this crisis. And then President Petro asked for a massive protest in order to show support for the country's independence.
Indeed. And you were at that massive protest where thousands of supporters there were attending, but they actually were then in for another twist in this story.
Yes, absolutely. Because what we saw was basically a build-up. We saw people gathering on the Simon Bolivar Square. We saw people painting a huge US flag with Nazi symbols, as you can see, and basically skulls. Everybody was ready for a big anti-Trump and anti-American imperialism rally, which is not what happened at all, because basically what happened was President Petro just arrived very late on the stage and fumbled for a bit, then fished a piece of paper out of his pocket and said, well, look, I had a speech ready, and in fact, I can't use it because I'm going to have to change everything I had planned to say because I've just spoken to President Trump. And then he went on to say, well, and I quote, that President Trump did write on Truth Social, it was an honor to speak to President Petro, that he liked his tone, that he liked what he had to say, and basically that the problem seemed to be at least partially solved, or in any case ready for major de-escalation, with a visit scheduled by President Petro to the White House. Donald Trump inviting him. Petro had also invited Trump the other way around. That's not happening for now. But basically, beginning of February, there could be a visit, and the idea would be to iron out the differences between the two leaders, with President Petro went on in that quite lengthy speech to explain that for him, well, the right-wing parties had basically tried to convince Trump that he was a bad president, that he was not fighting against organized crime and drug trafficking, and he had managed to set the record straight. So that's where we stand right now. And this is all against the backdrop of future elections.
So given that turnaround for many of those protesters, did you talk to people the next day, and what did they have to say?
Well, we spoke to quite a few people in the capital, a lot of them saying, well, relieved. That was the first thing. I'd say relief and surprise. Some people telling us, look, I was sure that President Petro would come up with an intelligent solution, would find a negotiated way out of this crisis. Others telling us, well, look, this is completely weird to see the president who'd said so many bad things about Trump and the other way around, and now seeing that they appear to be best buddies and saying, well, we don't see where this is going. But what I can tell you is that indeed there are, parliamentary elections on the 8th of March. There are presidential elections on the 31st of May. President Petro cannot represent himself. I mean, he's had his term and that's that. So, there is this very strong political backdrop. And of course, these declarations by Donald Trump and what's going to happen in the White House is going to have a major impact on those elections, with people basically from both sides saying that, well, for the right, that Petro is going to instrumentalize this visit to the White House, saying that he cannot do that and that he shouldn't. And then on the left, people worried that indeed Trump's obvious bias will be towards the right, and that might change the result of the election. So a lot of political tension there, and of course a lot of question marks before this state visit.